Hello and welcome to the ChessMate-ink channel. If you are new to chess, there are 7 essential things you must know. When you learn these 7 concepts and apply them in your games, you will start winning much more comfortably. Since this video is theory-based, we will analyze these 7 points through a played game, so you don't get bored. The game we will analyze is the first game of the 6-game match played in Philadelphia in 1996, between world champion Garry Kasparov with the black pieces and Deep Blue with the white pieces. First, let's start the game on the left side. As we go through these points, you can analyze the game yourself beforehand. Keep your eyes on the board and your ears on the narration. After the explanations, we will go through the game together, step by step. There is a special reason why we chose this match. This first game Kasparov played against Deep Blue in 1996 was historically important because it was among the first classical games where a world champion lost to a computer. Deep Blue's ability to calculate around 200 million positions per second showed that artificial intelligence was beginning to approach human strength. This sparked a global debate on whether creativity or calculation power would prevail. Although Kasparov won the match 4-2, this encounter accelerated IBM's investments in AI and paved the way for the historic 1997 rematch in which Deep Blue defeated Kasparov. Here, however, we will analyze that very first encounter from 1996. If you learned chess through our 14-episode training series, the basic tactics we will show in this final lesson will give you a strong foundation for everything you've learned. If you're discovering ChessMate-ink with this video and some concepts sound unfamiliar, we strongly recommend checking out our previous lessons first. There we explain the basic rules, piece movement, special rules, and many tactics in detail. Now, let's briefly summarize the 7 points you must always pay attention to in your games, which we'll soon explain on the board as well. First, piece movement and values. You must know how each piece moves and its approximate value. Second, opening principles. Controlling the center, developing your pieces patiently, and castling at the right time directly affect the quality of your game. Our third point, king safety. Our most important piece is the king. Therefore, we must place it on safe squares and check its safety after every move. Fourth, fundamental chess rules. You must know rules such as check, checkmate, stalemate, promotion, en passant, the threefold repetition rule, and use some of them against your opponent while avoiding certain dangerous situations. Our fifth point, basic tactical motifs. Forks, pins, skewers. These are some of the most decisive tactical themes in chess. We will see most of these tactics in this game on the board. Our sixth point, basic checkmating techniques. Knowing simple mates, such as queen versus king or rook versus king, is essential for understanding how pieces work together as a team. Our seventh and most important rule, patience. Being patient is extremely important in chess. Beginners often play too fast and want to win immediately, but the biggest mistakes usually come from rushing. For example, in a 10-minute game, try to spend at least 15 to 20 seconds per move if possible. When you rush, the likelihood of making a mistake increases significantly. Keep these 7 points in mind. Now, without tiring you with more theory, let's begin analyzing this legendary game step by step. Deep Blue starts the game with pawn to e4. The purpose of this move is to control the central squares. The central squares are where pieces have maximum mobility. For example, a queen on the edge controls 21 squares, while a queen in the center can reach 28 squares. This is why you should prioritize central control in your games. Focus on maintaining control of the center from your very first move. Kasparov replies with pawn to c5, which is the Sicilian defense. In this opening, instead of placing a pawn directly in the center with e5, black pressures the center from the side by playing c5. The Sicilian is one of the most dynamic defenses against white's e4. We will definitely cover its details in future videos. Pawn to c3. White prepares d4 with this move. The aim is to strengthen central control. Pawn to d5. Black immediately challenges the center. Here, black wants to prevent white from establishing full control over the center. Pawn takes d5, and queen takes d5. Kasparov captures the pawn with his queen, but this move carries some risk. Bringing out heavy pieces, like the queen or rooks, early in the game often leads to problems. The reason is, light pieces, knights and bishops, can attack the queen. If the queen comes under attack, it must move every time it is threatened. This wastes time for the queen, while helping the opponent develop their minor pieces for free. Pawn to d4 and knight to f6. Black develops the knight and pressures the center. Developing minor pieces is extremely important in the opening. Knight to f6 means being close to the center and creating threats. Knight to f3. White develops the knight and prepares to castle kingside. Black plays bishop to g4, pinning the knight. What does pin mean? If the knight jumps to any square, the bishop can capture the queen behind it. So if the knight moves, you lose your most valuable piece, the queen. Therefore, the knight is temporarily tied and cannot move freely. White plays bishop to e2, breaking the pin. Now, if the knight moves, the bishop, which is equal in value, would be captured instead of the queen. This is a more acceptable trade for white. Black plays pawn to e6, strengthening central control and opening the diagonal for the bishop on f8. This allows that bishop to join the game as well. Let's pause for a moment and look at the overall position. Although 14 moves have been played, neither side has touched their flank pawns yet. Because both sides are focused on controlling the center and developing their pieces first. Make sure to follow this example in your own games. The next move is white pushing the pawn to h3, asking black to make a decision. Either take the knight or retreat your bishop. Black chooses to retreat with bishop to h5, keeping the pressure on the knight for a while longer. Deep blue castles, moving the king away from the center to a safer square. In this way, it avoids possible attacks in the center. Unless there are exceptions, castling early is almost always a good idea. Black plays knight to c6, bringing the second knight closer to the center and continuing development. White develops with bishop to e3 and supports the pawn on d4. Pawn takes d4. Kasparov wants to resolve the tension in the center here. When pawn exchanges in the center are done at the right moment, they simplify the position and help you understand the board better. Pawn takes d4 and bishop to b4. Black brings the last minor piece into the game and completes development. White plays pawn to a3, saying, "I don't want the bishop to stay here," forcing it to retreat. Such pawn moves are used to force your opponent to make a decision. Black retreats with bishop to a5, staying active on an open diagonal. White plays knight to c3, developing the last minor piece. This is a very nice move, because white both develops a piece and attacks the queen. Queen to d6. Kasparov moves the queen back, escaping the attack, but it still stands on a square where it can be targeted by minor pieces. White plays knight to b5, attacking the queen again. This is a concrete example of the risk we mentioned earlier. When the queen comes out into the center too early, it can be constantly harassed by knights and bishops and is forced to retreat over and over again. This leads to a loss of time and tempo. This time, black's queen retreats to a safer square with queen to e7. Deep blue places the knight on a very active square with knight to e5. We need to pay attention here, because white is launching a discovered attack in this position. So what is a discovered attack? When the knight moves, it opens the line for the bishop, and the bishop now threatens to capture the bishop on h5. We call this a discovered attack. If your opponent is not Kasparov, you should definitely try this tactic in your games. Many players lose material because they don't notice this kind of discovered attack. Kasparov plays bishop takes e2, capturing white's bishop and at the same time attacking the queen. So if white makes any other move, the queen will be lost. White must first recapture the bishop. White plays queen takes e2, recapturing the bishop. Black finally castles and brings the king to a safe zone. White plays rook to c1, bringing the rook to a semi-open file. For rooks, the best places are usually open or semi-open files. You should definitely pay attention to this in your games, because a rook or queen on an open file has much more room to operate. Black applies the same idea with rook to c8. White plays bishop to g5, pinning the knight. We again see the basic tactical idea we just explained. If the knight moves, the queen behind it will be lost. Black plays bishop to b6, retreating the bishop to a safer square. Bishop takes f6, and pawn takes f6. This is a very important moment. By capturing the knight on f6, deep blue damages the pawn structure around black's king. In other words, the king's shelter is opened and becomes vulnerable to attacks. So, couldn't the queen capture the bishop here? After all, there was no piece defending the bishop. No, it couldn't. If black had taken with the queen, then knight to d7 would have followed, delivering a fork, and after the queen moves away, the knight would capture the rook, giving white a material advantage. So what is a fork? A fork is when a single piece threatens more than one piece at the same time. This basic tactic often wins you the game. Since black doesn't want this, he decides to recapture with the pawn instead of the queen, and at the same time uses the pawn to chase the knight away. White moves the knight to the c4 square. Black plays rook to d8, coming to the d-file and increasing the pressure on the pawn on d4. Remember, even being just one pawn up brings you a step closer to winning in the endgame. White captures the bishop with the knight. Black recaptures the knight with the pawn. White further damages black's pawn structure. Now the pawns on b6 and b7 form a weak structure. Rook to d1 and pawn to f5. White brings the rook to the central file and also defends the pawn. Queen to e3 and queen to f6. By bringing the queen in, white increases the defense of the pawn, while black increases the pressure on this central pawn. Pawn to d5. Now it is time for this pawn to advance, even if this move seems to leave the pawn on b2 undefended. Black cannot capture this pawn right now because the knight would come under attack, so the rook captures on d5. Here, black finds the best possible move. If black had captured with the pawn, the entire pawn structure here would have been ruined, so the rook capture is definitely the best choice. At the same time, it launches an attack on the undefended knight. White's rook captures the black rook and forces black to recapture with the pawn. With this, black's pawn chain is broken, and at the same time, the threat against the knight disappears. Black plays pawn takes d5, recapturing. Now an isolated pawn has formed on d5. So what is an isolated pawn? An isolated pawn is a pawn that is not protected by any other pawn. It is vulnerable to attacks. Pawn to b3. White moves the loose pawn to a safer square. Kasparov plays king to h8, moving the king into the corner. He wants to prepare for possible threats coming from the g-file. White plays queen takes b6, capturing the weak pawn. This pawn was weak because, as mentioned earlier, it was alone and disconnected from the other pawns. Black plays rook to g8, preparing a very strong attacking idea. At first glance, it looks like black is leaving the pawn on b7 undefended, but this is actually a trap. If white captured the pawn on b7, black would play queen to g5, creating a fork threat, attacking mate on g2 and attacking the rook at the same time. Since white would have to stop the mate, the rook would almost certainly be lost. In response, deep blue plays queen to c5. Of course, deep blue calculates all of this and doesn't take the pawn. First, it protects the rook with the queen. Then, even if black plays queen to g5, white can simply push the pawn forward and block the attack. Pawn to d4. Black pushes the pawn and creates a passed pawn, bringing it one step closer to the final square. At the same time, he moves an unprotected pawn to a square guarded by the queen. But this is a mistake. Instead, the rook should have gone to d8, because after this move, knight to d6 comes, delivering a fork. The knight threatens two pawns and will capture one of them. This forces black to make a difficult decision. Black plays pawn to f4, choosing to protect the f-pawn and continue attacking chances on the king side. Knight takes b7. White captures this pawn and gains a material advantage. If you compare all the pieces, white is now up a pawn. But doing this right now is wrong, because knight to e5 increases black's kingside pressure. Queen to d5. White finds the correct move and prevents possible mating threats. Black plays pawn to f3, a premature and incorrect move. If black had played queen to g5 before this, in the following sequence, white would have to sacrifice the rook to avoid mate, and black would gain the advantage. There is another important point here. Black pushed this pawn, but white cannot capture it, because the white pawn is pinned. This pawn cannot leave the g-file, because it is the only piece standing between the black rook and the king. So deep blue plays pawn to g3, taking control of the f4 square and calmly meeting the attack. In response, black plays knight to d3, both protecting the loose pawn with the queen and attacking the rook with the knight. Rook to c7. White brings the rook to the 7th rank, both attacking the pawn and creating mating threats. Rook to e8. Black ignores the attack on the pawn and plans a counterattack. But this is a mistake, because white plays knight to d6, delivering a fork. With this move, white guarantees winning the pawn and will continue with check, gaining the advantage. Black plays rook to e1, giving check and saving the rook from the fork. Still, the overall position now favors white. Deep blue plays king to h2, making the only possible move. Knight takes f2. Black plays knight takes f2, hoping for one last mating chance. The idea is to bring the rook to h1 and checkmate, but it is now too late. Because white plays knight takes f7, capturing the pawn and giving check. This forces black to move the king. The king goes to g7, but escape is almost impossible now, because white has a beautiful move. White plays knight to g5, giving a discovered check. By moving out of the way, the rook gives the check, and white prevents any one-move mate possibilities for black. The king goes to h6, still searching for a chance, but Kasparov's king is now completely trapped. And here comes the finishing move from white. Rook takes h7, check. White captures the pawn and gives check. Black is now caught in a mating net. There is no escape. Kasparov resigns here, because white is both ahead in material and mate is unavoidable within a few moves. After this game, 5 more games were played. In the final result, Garry Kasparov finished with 4 points and Deep Blue with 2 points, meaning Kasparov won the match by 2 points. If you'd like us to analyze the other games as well, feel free to mention it in the comments. For now, we've reached the end of today's lesson. Don't forget to move on to the next video and subscribe to improve your chess. ChessMate-ink wishes you a chess-filled day.